a significant part of this series is going to appertain to jobs. What is a job? But as a preliminary to that, I feel that it's essential to understand that one of the chief purposes of the conservative status quo or the conservative paradigm is the annihilation of community. All of this could be traced back to the time where Franklin Roosevelt died. He gave his Four Freedoms speech and then died. And then Truman took over and, of course, went apeshit with nuclear weapons and blew up Japan, and you pretty much know the rest of how that aspect goes. But Roosevelt tried to establish this sense of community among nations. You had first the good neighbor policy, but you also had this sense of community through the United Nations, because one of the things that Roosevelt foresaw was the evil of using militarism, which is essentially the same thing that Adolf Hitler did, as a means to create a sense of social wealth, a sense of security and well-being, and to create jobs. So on the one hand, when you are, or if you're one of these people that are opposed to this idea of one world government, what you're actually opposed to is the sense of community amongst nations. Now, there is a group called the World Federalist Society. You could Google them. But the idea behind the United Nations is very much similar to the ideas behind classical federalism, or actually more akin to what our Confederation was. So it would seem to be a very appealing proposition to the chief opponents of the Federalist Party, which are, of course, the Democratic Republicans. Just think of it in these terms. When everyone's cheering about, you know, the government just destroyed people, killed people, blew some country up, blew some city up or whatever, and everybody's cheering and doing the national anthem and all of this business. Well, are you standing around saying this is terrible, this is a direct blow to Old Glory and the Southern Confederation and all this? I don't hear any Southern white male Christian Democrats complaining about this. In fact, it seems as though they are the chief proponents of this sort of thing. You know, and you look back at the rearmament initiatives of Franklin Roosevelt, and you see that the way that he was able to get a lot of things from the Southerners was to build defense plants there. The whole idea behind the United Nations is the antithesis of this rearmament initiative or deployment or whatever, because Roosevelt foresaw the evil of it. And one of the founding principles of the United Nations is the idea that we spend enough money on war and ordnance, and it's time to invest this money in the general welfare. And if you look at the various instruments that go along with the United Nations Charter that were offered for ratification around that period of time, you'll see that this runs through those documents. It's a common thread. The idea of using the national resources for the purposes of improving the life of the people, rather than improving the life of Daddy Warbucks. So on this one level, or as the Federalists used to refer to it as orbit, you have this idea that there shall be world peace, that the will of the nations after the so-called World War II was world peace, and that if there is some outbreak of world peace, that the nations combined together in the form of a community will alleviate this error or difference of opinion. You know, if you speak to the war hawks, mostly Democrats, they will tell you it was the communists did it, you know, and you get into this thing with Berlin and the wall, and then you have all of these hippies or grunge people are saying tear down that wall, you know, and this whole bit. You know, so again, the United States could do no wrong. It was somebody else that did this. Well, the point of it is that that whole idea of a community of nations was annihilated, and people that are in favor of that by you know, all these one world government conspiracies and all that, that's essentially what you're destroying. You're being used as a tool by these people. At the next orbit, or at a more micro level from that macro aspect, you have in the United States this idea of states' rights, as opposed to the federal Constitution as establishing a form of federal community, the Union as opposed to the Confederacy. And this goes all the way down to the family unit, because essentially the family, establishing this idea of a family, which goes far beyond anything having to do with procreation. It has more to do with control. Is the essential tool of the status quo in the further annihilation of this sense of community. So the first point in this is that when people ask rhetorically or otherwise, why are the police busting the heads of peaceful protesters in the Occupy movements, various places throughout the United States? It's essentially because these people are conservatives and they are terrified at the thought of community. Stop and think about it. Aside from these forms of assembly, what is the only other form of assembly that you have that's anywhere near this sort of thing? Well, you have rock concerts, but prior to the phenomenon of rock concerts, you had sporting events, primarily football games and baseball games. And anytime you have this sort of assembly, the conservatives become terrified. And actually, this goes back even further to Thomas Hobbes and this book that he wrote called Leviathan, which is based on the belief that humanity is essentially evil. It all goes back to the idea, you know, Adam and Eve and the fall of man, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea becomes confused and confounded with religion, confused and confounded with progeny and procreation. And at the same time, it gets confused and confounded with this idea that conservatives are out to get government off your back, when in reality, it's just the opposite. Because if you think about this, if you think about what conservatives are discussing when they talk traditional family values, they are imposing standards upon you that cannot be fulfilled. You're supposed to act a certain way when you're a husband. You're supposed to act a certain way when you're a wife, when you're a parent, the way that you raise your children, what your children are allowed to do. Your behavior in everyday life is being dictated to you by conservatives, either in the form of a political party or in the form of a political party occupying the offices of government. Because of the family unit essentially is the main tool for the annihilation of community. Because once this becomes nearly incestual, get in your house, spend time with your family, don't be out gallivanting. The whole sense of community goes from your mind. You forget what it is. You forget what it's about. You forget what socialization is about. Socialization becomes sublimated by family events, doing things with the family. It's the easiest way to control people. So various boogeymans are created. You know, you probably feel like, oh, I don't know about this blazintommyd1's talking about all this anti-family business. You know, it's like, I'm not talking about anti-family. I'm talking about anti-family the way it's perceived and imposed by conservatives. It's not necessary. And what's happened is that people have evolved beyond that, and conservatives fail to see that. Now, there are some people that adhere to these ideas. They're probably so far from the conservative imposition that they just maintain the outward appearances, the superficiality of it, to hide this difference. Whether that's true or not, the effect is the same. And you get this idea that I take care of my own. I have my family to take care of, you know. So if there's some person starving, he ain't my family. If there's some person that needs some kind of medical assistance, hey, he ain't my family. I don't need to pay for that. I want to keep my money. I got to take care of my family. So this whole thing becomes, society becomes broken up and fragmented into these little family units, which really don't have very much in common other than you could assemble for the purposes of furthering the conservative ideals that appertain to their imposition regarding family. You could go to church and you could talk about your family. You could go to banquets and talk about your family. You could go to weddings with your family. When you stop and think about it, it is the antithesis of community.